Hey, what's up, Dave? How's it going?
Living the dream, man. Living the
Right on.
dream.
Same, same. So I caught your talk yesterday or your panel. What was it? Applied AI or whatever it was
Applied
called.
AI, yeah, for Open Data
What
Science Conference.
was that about?
So it was just a panel about getting real, getting a view from the trenches around how AI is applied, which I always find interesting because this day and age, people have an interesting idea of what AI is. I mean, from what I can see in the blogosphere and on LinkedIn and on various types of social media platforms, everyone seems to associate it with like, I got to have a deep neural network, right? I got to have BERT. I don't have BERT. I'm not doing AI.
Right.
Um, and I come, and you can tell from the gray here, I'm a little bit on the right side of the demographic age-wise. So for me, artificial intelligence is an umbrella term from computer science that includes all kinds of things, including expert systems, for example. So
Hmm.
it was interesting to be on that panel, for have them to invite somebody like me with my perspective on it to participate and talk about applied AI, which I tend to interpret as like putting a machine learning model in production and taking a human out of the decision loop. Basically, that's how I look at this point in time. And that idea has been around for a long time, long time. So it was good. We had a diverse panel, and Ben Taylor hosted and moderated, and we had some really good questions. It was a lot of fun. So I hope the audience got a lot out of it.
Yeah, I caught the tail end of it. I think what I found impressive was if you if you looked at the AI discussions, I would say even 2 years ago, um, it was. I found it interesting. A lot of it was like model based or this, that, or the other thing, like really high tech and almost eschewing things like SQL and analytics and knowing your customer, knowing the business and whatnot. I got out of the conversation though. It was interesting, at least at the end that I caught, where participants were definitely acknowledging that understanding the business and taking a very simple approach was the preferred way to go. I think it was the topic of what to focus on for the next 5 or 10 years or something, and it was all pretty basic stuff, which I thought was actually like really cool and really value add. Because for the longest time, the discussion was just like out into like how complicated can you possibly make stuff, right? And
Hmm.
I think
Yeah.
it's focusing the conversation like sort of at least with this panel, converge back to something a bit more realistic. So,
Yeah, and I think maybe I'm a big fan, not surprisingly, as you well know, of the Gartner hype cycle. I'm not a big fan of necessarily everything Gartner does, but I do like the hype cycle. You've been around a while as well, so you saw this with the whole big data thing, right? You don't hear anyone really using the term big data much anymore, like you did 4 or 5 years ago, right? So it went, whoosh. And then people finally started to get a handle on data engineering and what does it mean. And now it's like it's just kind of accepted, like, yeah, you've got large sources of data with velocity and variety and volume and blah 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 blah
mhm.
blah. Cool, right? I got all of that now. How do I actually make business ROI out of it? That's really what we're talking about. And I think that's kind of reflected a little bit maybe in the panel yesterday, is that we're starting to like maybe hit the crest for in terms of machine learning, applied machine learning, and we might be heading towards the trough of despair, as Gardner calls it.
When you look at the Gartner hype cycle, I mean, that's where traditionally the biggest opportunities are found. Because I think, when you're going up to the peak, I mean, there's a lot of noise and a lot of clamoring. I think a lot of attention seeking too for like all the wrong reasons. Big data kind of went through this actually, where I
Mm-hmm.
remember back in the early 2010s, it was big data was the conversation was like, well, how big is your data set? Right. It became this measuring contest on that. And similarly with AI, it was, uh, like, oh, what kind of, like, how many hidden layers are you using in your model?
Right, right. How many neurons do you got?
Yeah. It's like, being like, so, so it's again, it's refreshing seeing, I mean, I hope that ML is going into the trough of disillusionment or whatever it's called. That I think is a refreshing take, because again, that's like where all the real advances start happening, because all the posers and the all the hype is just sort of filtered out, and now it's time to actually figure out how you're going to make this work for real. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like you don't hear a lot about Cloudera or MapR or any of those companies anymore, right?
No, not too
It's
often.
just 8 years ago, it was like, whoa, they were like everywhere.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean what they were producing wasn't valuable. It was just going up the hype cycle, like you were saying, right? Everyone was like, I got to get in on this. I
Mhm.
think I mentioned in a post or in another venue somewhere where uh, a general manager asked me once about if we could replace our SAN with Hadoop because he got tired of paying for SAN for our relational database engines, and he heard that he could get 4 cents a gig storage using Hadoop,
Okay.
right? And this is the kind of stuff you're going through when you're going up the hype cycle, and you're just sitting there going, "Oh, how do I deal with this?"
Sure. I remember seeing like data lakes, back in the day. I mean, they'd have maybe have like a few gigs of data. At that point, you're just like, well, why don't you just, and it's structured data too. It's not like it's images or something. So why don't you just put that in a database?
Right.
It's like, well, we need to use Hadoop for this.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're supposed to do.
I've got a hammer. Where's my
Mhm.
nail?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's nuts. But
Yeah.
same,
So the panel yesterday was pretty refreshing as far as that goes.
it really was. Yeah. Yeah. I was impressed by I guess the candor of the panel and also just, yeah. It was exactly the opposite of what I thought it would be. I mean, you were on there, and I wasn't sure if it was like because we need the token heretic to troll other people, but it's definitely not like that.
Dave's on this panel. What? They're either asking for trouble or they want the token heretic on the panel.
Yeah, you got to hit the heretic quota for the day. So, yeah, have
Yeah.
you in many panels like this lately, or
It's definitely picking up. Getting more requests for talking and that sort of thing. I think part of that might be just a reflection of one, the times, right? A lot of these things are virtual and it's a lot easier to be like, I can pick diverse people from all around the world as long as they're online with a good internet connection. So I think that certainly helps. But then there's also I think there's this interest in data in general. And because of the current economic situation, the interest is like it's not the pie in the sky CIO magazine stuff anymore. People are like, okay, the economy is problematic. I really want to use my data to make more money or save cost or something like that. So let's get real about
yeah,
what we're doing. So I think you're starting to see like the panel yesterday, I think was more a reflection of this idea of like, hey, let's not do a real cool computer vision project just because it's cool. Let's say we just need something that's good enough in production that's going to generate more revenue or save us some cost. So let's talk about that. So that's good for me.
yeah, absolutely.
That's good for me because I've been like step away from the neural networks for a number of years now, so I wasn't getting a lot of play.
No, no, not at all. I could see that not going over very well. A couple of years ago, but a lot's changed, I think. Like from what I've seen, data science has just become a lot more accessible to people, and then which also means a lot more people are trying it out,
Mhm.
and then that leads to people realizing, wow, this is actually like really hard to do well, and maybe we should, there's some other ways to simplify it. And maybe you don't need to use machine learning. I think, something you hammer on a lot of SQL. That's like, I think a lot of things you try and do with ML, like in classifications, you might be able to get away with in doing a group by statement, for example. Um,
Yeah,
so,
yeah, absolutely. So
yeah.
when I used to teach at a former employer, I used to teach a week-long boot camp, intensive boot camp for working pros on the basics of data science. This is what I would tell them at the very beginning of the week: is you need to use machine learning primarily in just a couple of scenarios. One is where a human could detect the patterns, but it would take so long to analyze the data that it's not cost effective. So use the machine to find the patterns. Or the pattern is so complicated that a human being isn't going to find it. But when you think of it that way, then you're like, well, you know what? There's so many things that you just in business analytics, applied business analytics, where you just don't need machine learning. It just doesn't make any sense.
That's a
And a
really good,
group by and a group by statement is like a prime example of that, right?
yeah, because I've seen people try and use like k-means clustering, like where a group by would have just done literally the same thing because
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah,
kind of all there. So you're like,
exactly. I mean, clustering is great when it's like, for some reason, like you have very wide data set. You have a bunch of attributes that are so complicated that you'd be like, well, even if I could group by, the results in SSMS, let's say, would be too complicated for a human to grok. So that's where machine learning can come in helpful. But people want to do the cool stuff. They
So
just
we
want to do the cool
talked
stuff.
about educating people on getting back. What are what are some of the bigger challenges you're seeing in terms of getting people engaged to maybe take a step back and simplify things?
Um, the single biggest challenge, quite frankly, in my dealings in talking, speaking, social media, that sort of thing, is job descriptions.
Hmm.
The job descriptions are, in my opinion, on average, highly inflated. And this happens. I remember when big data was hot. I remember when Spark first came out and it was really hot, and people were putting job postings up with like X number of years of Scala experience or Scala, depending on how you pronounce it. And Scala hadn't been around that long. It's just this, you see these occasionally on various social media platforms where people post a job description and they're like, what? Like I saw one recently on LinkedIn where they asked for like X number of years of experience in this particular framework, and the framework builder, the guy that built the framework, got on there and said, I can tell you it hasn't been around this long.
Oh, Fast API, I think it was, or Fast API.
Oh, okay. Did you
Yeah,
see
yeah,
that one too?
that's
Yeah.
one of those. But yeah, it's hilarious.
So that's a lot of the pushback I get, especially like in direct messages. People like, hey, Dave, I totally get what you're saying at a high level. But when I look at the job descriptions, they want X number of years of Python. They want these types of, AI, more machine learning skill sets. And they don't mention SQL at all and these kinds of things. And I'm like, well, yeah, here's the thing you need to know. And a lot of companies, that's based out of the data ignorance, the data illiteracy of the HR departments and hiring managers. They just don't really know. So they just grab from the hype train and then put the check boxes on the JD. So that's the biggest thing that I face right now, where people are like, I hear what you're saying, but I can't get a job if I follow your advice. And of course, my response is, yeah, but if you had the job, you'd realize this is what you actually do every day. So I'm kind of in this catch 22 there. Yeah.
That's interesting. How do you think people should address that then with employers that are looking for maybe skill set A and what they really need is skill set B?
It's tough. I mean, I'm not gonna lie that it's not tough. If you're someone who's out of work looking for a job, or you're somebody who's really, really excited about getting into the field, I wouldn't be I'm not going to tell you to ignore the things that are on the job descriptions. Unfortunately, that's not sound advice. If that's your job, if that's your goal is to land the job, then you have to meet the check boxes primarily. What I would like to do is what I tend to be focusing on these days is these, rather than is more of the demand side of the equation, right? The people writing the job descriptions, the people doing the hiring, is to say, look, can we train them on the basics of data? Because one of the things that I know happens in a lot of companies, for example, is you have professional managers, folks that are maybe in charge of a technical team, like an analytics team or a software engineering team or a data engineering team, but they're not actually from a technical background. They're a professional manager. Their skill is managing people, managing budgets, that sort of thing. Um, those folks are ripe for some education around the basics of data. One of the things I talk about on social media is like, imagine a world where every hiring manager, no matter what role they're in, what part of the organization they're in, understands things like variation, the basics of linear regression conceptually, and the basics of logistic regression conceptually. I mean, people like, whoa, that would be so awesome. It would make my life as a data professional so much easier. And that's where I'm focusing now these days.
That's good. It's an interesting insight in that I think it's a hard-won insight. Um, it's it's incredibly difficult to arrive at that conclusion it's almost like a lot of people focus on the supply side of data science skills and not so much the supply side of the people who will be managing them. But I think personally, I've seen more data projects fail because of either poor management or organizational politics getting in the way and like budgets getting cut, which means you don't need your data science team anymore or
Right.
any of that kind of stuff. And a lot of it is just, I think to your point, due to a lack of appreciation or understanding of the value that the data science team could provide. So, and sometimes I think it's justified and sometimes not. Sometimes teams
Yeah.
don't do anything. So,
Yeah. Yeah. They're not delivering value. That's a different equation altogether.
yeah.
And the scary thing is like, it's so many things in my life. It's like, I look back and it's like, dude, why did it take you so long to get to this point? Because I've been an IT guy, right? I've been in the tech field for a long time, and I got my start working in corporate IT. And I used to lament the fact that no one understood IT. You know, they're constantly beating us up over delivery times and our budget and all these kinds of things. And they're just like, they just don't understand the value of IT. And so you would think it would have occurred to me sooner that, well, you know what, if business folks and managers and whoever understood the basics of data, that would make my life easier because I lived through it already. But it took me a while to get here. So, and it is currently my current mission and my current passion, because I am fully convinced that the greatest ROI potential for data in organizations is not in a fancy AI model deployed. It's not in a data science team. It's not even in a self-service BI initiative, for example. It's about having a data literate organization. Can people actually use the data to make better decisions?
I guess what kinds of companies do you think that uh, I guess would pick up data literacy more quickly than maybe another company? Like what would be the ingredients you'd look for in a company where you'd find that this is going to be something that sticks with them?
Yeah, based on my experience, it's going to be in general. Now, this is obviously a gross generalization, to be sure. A lot of the companies that implicitly rely on data, whether they know it or not. So, like for example, a thing like financial services, they don't really manufacture a physical product. They don't necessarily deliver a services. Delivering a service, a human-based service, isn't necessarily their primary economic engine. Or an insurance company, for example. I worked for years at a property and casualty insurance company. And sure, we had claims folks that came out and looked at your house or your car if they were damaged for an insurance claim. But generally speaking, the vast majority of the money-making engine was completely just ones and zeros in a computer somewhere. Um, the insurance industry is also interesting because, of course, they have actuaries. And there's a certain claim for actuaries to say, hey, look, we've been doing data science for a long time, people. You guys are just new to the game. So those types of industries, I think, tend to be a little bit more amenable to data literacy because there's this idea that in the end, we're not doing physical products. So financial services is a very good place, I think, for that. Doesn't mean that not every industry could benefit from it. Healthcare, of course, manufacturing, definitely. But you tend to see certain industries are more data centric to begin with, just from their economic engine perspective. And I think those are probably more likely to be early adopters.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. I guess what would be the key things you look for in a person to whether they'd be receptive to being data literate or not?
Yeah, so there's definitely there's been lots of books and there's lots of writers and thinkers that you can take a look at that will talk about the different types of people along the bell curve, like early adopters, fast movers, slow adopters, that sort of thing. So obviously, folks that tend to be of the fast mover camp personality wise, no matter where they work, are likely to do this. They'll be like, oh, data's the thing. I want to be on it. I've read about it. I've seen it. Yeah, I'll embrace this training. I'm going to embrace it. The other is, and I've had some success with this before, is also those that have a bit of a competitive spirit. If you're a manager and you're competing with other managers in your organization, which is often the case, quite frankly, for bonus or promotion or whatever it might be, being data literate might give you an edge. And so folks that are also in that camp also can be receptive to the message. But in general, what you really want ideally is a very senior level executive. It doesn't have to be the CEO, but obviously that would be the best, but a very senior level executive saying, I want to use data to give me a competitive advantage in the marketplace, either top line or bottom line, or costs to affect the bottom line. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Those are the kinds of people that are going to be most amenable. And then hopefully you can start at the top and then work your way down. You can certainly do grassroots from the bottom up, but really getting to a data-driven organization, a data-literate organization, typically you need some level of executive sponsorship.
Yeah, sure. I think that's been my experience too. If it starts from I wouldn't say if it starts at the top, but if the top gets it and there's top down and bottom up alignment, then that tends to be most successful. Because you run into the Michael Scott syndrome where like, say Michael Scott from The Office gets very data literate. It's not to say like, because he doesn't have he doesn't have the reputational capital of the rest of his company, right? They just think he's a buffoon, so they're not going to listen to him. They'll just be like, yeah, I'll
yeah, unless he generates like extraordinary results, and then people start paying attention, like, well, what's Michael doing?
Yeah.
And Michael's like, I'm using data. And that's when people go, oh, maybe we should use data too.
Right. Yeah, this guy's making success, and we definitely
right.
So yeah, and it's been interesting, and yeah, I talked to data scientists and data engineers who have the issue with the grassroots, like they're trying to make a change, but if their boss doesn't get it or the boss's boss doesn't get it, then it's kind of like, well, now we're just doing cool stuff in a silo, and sometimes that works. Sometimes, one of our clients, I mean, it started out that way, and they're seeing a ton of success right now from that approach. And they're slowly lobbying and getting other people to support them as they're, seeing success. But that's kind of like, the classic story of like a river, like just on a pile of rocks, and over centuries it starts changing the rocks underneath it. But that takes a very long time to do.
Yeah.
Yes. Worse.
I'm also a big fan. So I'm not like exclusively thinking that from a targeting perspective that it has to be somebody with like a director title or VP title or something like that or higher. An individual professional can decide for themselves, look, I think if I had some data literacy, if I had some skills with data analysis, that I could do my job more effectively. And that's excellent as well. I mean, I definitely target and try to message folks like that to say, look, it doesn't matter what your organization's necessarily doing. You, as a professional, can learn these data analysis skills. You don't have to take linear algebra. You don't have to take multivariate calculus. You don't have to. Those things help, of course, but it's not required, because most business analytics, as you've alluded to already, is basically mostly simple stuff for the most part. That's all you really need. And just about any professional can learn that and do their individual job better. And that's one way for them, for example, to differentiate themselves on their team. Or maybe, just maybe, they learn these data literacy skills, they rock it out, they get promoted to management. And then it's essentially this transformation from within kind of thing.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to take on, and the things I've seen where like data, say that a company wants to start doing data, and taking advantage of the data they have. What the biggest immediate obstacle I see is if the data that they have is crappy and it needs to be fixed, or any number of things related to that. Like, I don't know, is that something you've seen too, or maybe like the data quality initiatives or lack of data governance comes back to basically just be a giant wall impeding any forward progress for data literacy?
Yeah, it is. It is a consistent problem. This is where, in my experience, smaller companies often have a disadvantage because they don't necessarily have the financial wherewithal to have data management professionals to worry about these sorts of things. As a consultant and as an employee, I see it all the time in the smaller companies where, there's an idea like, hey, we want to do X. And we need data. We need you to analyze the data to figure out whether or not this is actually going to happen. And you go in as a data professional, you look at the data and you're like, well, we really should have like address verification at the edge when people are entering it, because these addresses are not any good. So you're not going to be able to do anything with them. And then you get this sad face response and you just move on. This is where some larger corporations have a bit of an advantage because they might have pros that worry about this sort of thing, data management pros. Yeah, and that's definitely a problem, because data is the raw material. If you don't have the raw material, then you can't build a model, you can't conduct an analysis, you can't do anything. So yeah, that's definitely a problem. One thing though is that you can always, in my experience, you can always find value-added things that you can do with data if you're creative and you look, especially at the low-hanging fruit. And then you can always find something that you can work on that you can deliver value with. And the great news is once you start delivering value, you can then go back and you can start saying, look, you know what? We could do more of this and we could do it better if we had data quality.
That's a really good point. Yeah, is that something you'd suggest that people do then? I mean, if they had like data quality issues, maybe start with start small and go from there.
Yeah, so I used to be an enterprise architect. So I characterize myself as a recovering enterprise architect, as a matter of fact, because I used to take exactly the opposite approach, which was like, no, it's a big bang, top down kind of thing, right? No data analysis until we get our data management processes in place and we're actually like clean, right? This is the Dama crowd kind of perspective on things. And that used to be mine as well, right? We're going to architect the enterprise and it's going to take a couple of years, but you know what? It's going to be awesome when we're done. And it went nowhere ever. So now I'm kind of anti-enterprise, I guess, for lack of a better way of describing it, where I say, unlike my former self, who was a UML junkie and all kinds of things, all the things, I don't do any of that anymore. And I like, look, find something that delivers business value. Nothing gets a business person's attention faster than ROI, especially executives. They love ROI. They love claiming credit for ROI. So that's a good way to get people's attention.
That's such an awesome point. Okay, switching gears, like what are some of the, I mean, you label yourself a data heretic, and I think that's one reason that I appreciate our conversations, either on a social or, you know, in video. Like, what are some of the more heretical things that have been on your mind lately?
Oh God. Yeah, Python. Not what you think. Okay. I'm an R guy. I know Python. I've used it before. I'm an R guy primarily, but it's not R versus Python. What I'm seeing, and it's got me concerned here lately, is that many people that are entering the field are seeing all those job descriptions, right? And the vast majority of them have Python listed. So they're learning Python. And then they think, oh my God, I've got the universal hammer to solve every problem, which is, if you know a general purpose programming language, that by definition is the universal hammer, because you can build anything with a general purpose programming language. That's what it's for. Doesn't mean that you should. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. So I hear about people talking about like, oh, I don't want to use Excel because I can't automate it. So I automated all this stuff in Python. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you can automate that in Python, but you know what? You could probably automate it easier using something maybe like SSIS, for example. That's why these tools exist. That's why companies use them. But I see a lot of people, they spend all this time and effort to learn Python, and for good reason, but then they don't broaden out their skills to say, look, is this the right tool for the situation at hand? And I've debated whether or not I should be posting on social media on that, but I'm thinking that might just like be a firestorm.
My vote is that you should.
Of course it is. You can watch me burn.
You know, I helped start the Salt Lake City Python meetup about almost 7 years ago now. I'm a Python person through and through, but you know, lately, even in our discussions in the Python meetup, I've said point blank, like I don't think this is the best language for everything. I think if you're dealing, I mean, Python, they call it like the second best language for everything. And I think that's perfectly fair. Like if you want to get something up quick and don't really care about, you know, whatever aspect, you know, that would make it more of a, you know, the first best language for something, then go for it. But I think there's a lot of cases where if you needed like, you know, higher performance, there's a lot of other languages I would pick first, right?
Yeah, Java, for example, can be quite fast when written correctly. C++, of course, right?
Sure.
You can get closer to the metal. I mean, you can do anything you want with C++, literally, or C for that matter. But people don't use it anymore because you know, they're harder to program. right? You have to worry about pointers and explicit memory management, and in C++, things like virtual destructors and all kinds of craziness. You don't really have to worry about that in some of the higher level languages like Python. Doesn't mean it's necessarily the universal hammer. The other thing, and if I could put back on my enterprise architect hat for a second, the other thing too is it's not just necessarily about the technical aspects that determine whether it's the right tool or not. There's also the cost aspect. Anytime you write a line of code, it is more expensive than a solution that doesn't require code, right? That's just a reality. There's a reason why things like Informatica and SSIS exist and are still used, because they do offer certain levels of productivity and total cost of ownership advantages over something that involves code. I don't see a lot of people thinking like that.
Not at all. And who was it? Last night we had a talk with was it Fivetran actually at the data engineering meetup. So Fivetran is they basically just build connectors that you can move data from point A to B, and you can get it set up in a couple of minutes, and then you're done. It removes a lot of undifferentiated heavy lifting. Like I always ask people that want to write their own stuff, and this is literally, I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. Like it's a person who, they're probably the same people that make their own car tires from scratch. Like they're just like,
That's a hobby.
I have my own tire that I like to make, and this is what I like to do. And similarly, it's like you ask them to build anything or do any task, and they'll just start writing code. Don't even bother looking at the off-the-shelf options, which, frankly, to your point, would save a lot of time and money because developer time is expensive. Data scientist time is expensive, and to rewrite existing stuff that really doesn't need to be rewritten, I think is like, that's heresy to me, actually. That's a cardinal sin. But unfortunately, I don't know about your experience, but that seems to be, I wouldn't say the norm, but pretty damn close to it.
Yeah. So when I worked at Microsoft, the evil empire, very early on in my tenure there, I had a great manager, and one of the things he instilled in me, and he was a software engineer himself, by the way, by trade, just so that we're clear on this point. He said, "Guess what happens when you hire software engineers? They write code." Right? So, and I think that's pretty much true for any technical professional. If they've only got one thing that they do, that's what they're going to do. And what I see is like people think because of what they see in social media, what they see in the job descriptions, what they see everyone talk about is Python, 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 Python.
Yeah.
Not that Python's bad. It's not. It's great. However, that mindset is bad. The mindset you're articulating, Joe, is bad, which is this like, I've got this thing, so I can build my own ETL engine. Why would I purchase one? It's just crazy. It's true story, by the way. So one of the groups I worked in at Microsoft, they built a custom ETL engine, a distributed ETL engine in C#. Even though Microsoft sells SSIS as part of the SQL Server stack. And we were using SQL Server, obviously, as the database, because it's Microsoft after all. But they still built this huge multi-threaded, very complicated distributed custom ETL engine because they thought they needed it. And one of the things that I saw happen was that thing got dismantled and replaced with SSIS. Right? Because SSIS is plenty good enough if you build it the right way. And here's the thing, you didn't need to hire a whole bunch of C# developers. Right?
Yeah.
You could hire other people to maintain it. It moved from like custom C# and all this really awesome stuff to SSIS and T-SQL. That was it.
Well, I think to your point about management too, I mean, an effective manager would be allocating those C# developers in the most effective way, right? Like, is their time really best spent building this ETL tool, or should we use them for something else? And that's, yeah. So I mean, to that point too, it's like, yeah, if it was a data science project, I mean, if that manager didn't have data literacy, for example, then they would be just, well, yeah, go for it. Like that sounds like a great idea to go reinvent the wheel on the company's dime. But if they had like the technical or data understanding, I think that would, you know, I think as a manager, you'd probably be hard pressed to want to justify that if you knew the alternatives and the trade-offs. But.
Right, and that circles back around to this problem that we have. Like if you're working for a professional manager who thinks Python is awesome because they've seen the same social media that the developers they hired have seen, they're like, of course we need to build this in Python because Python's awesome. And it's like, well, no, you don't. Not always. There's lots of things. Like, for example, I like R. I like it a lot. It's my favorite programming language now. It's supplanting C++. But I still use SSIS, for example. I'm on the SQL Server stack, and I use SSIS where it makes sense, because why wouldn't I? I'm not necessarily using R everywhere all the time, even though I like it, right? So I think Python is that would be my current heretical thing right now, the biggest one that I've got on my brain right now.
That's interesting. I mean, how much of this do you think is like due to like resume-driven development?
Oh, it's huge. It's absolutely huge, and not surprisingly so. I remember, like, for example, in the early part of the big data days, right? Everyone was learning Java, learning MapReduce, learning HiveQL, learning Hadoop, and all the things about it, because there were so many jobs, such high demand, and of course that was driving salaries up,
Mhm.
because supply didn't meet the demand, so the salaries are going up. And it was the same thing when Spark first came out, and Scala developers were super hot. I remember seeing a post where they're like, the average starting salary, or the average salary for a Scala data engineer on Spark, is like over $200,000 a year. It was like some astronomically high number because of the supply and demand. My guess is that's kind of gone down a bit since then.
Oh, here's the funny part about Spark too. I get the point that Spark came out in 2014 because I was like, oh, this it seemed kind of cool at the time. And part of me was like, well, I'll go learn Scala as well, and do the whole thing. But it's interesting because as Python, it's 2014. I think Spark was released, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and then Python also started seeing a surge. Like when I started my meetup in 2014, it was like the Python. We started as a web development group actually, because we at the time Python had some niche things like pandas and a few machine learning libraries, but nothing like now. But by about 2016 and 2017, Python became like the language. And what's hilarious now about the Scala example is uh, like PySpark is a pip install in Python now, and as far as I can tell, it's the language that they're most focusing on for usage for Spark. The core Spark community, because it's like everyone in data is using Python, and so they had. I think Java was one, but everyone's like, well, if you could have Python, we'll use your product now. And so it's interesting because I think to your point with the Scala hype cycle, that was hot, and all of a sudden it's like it's such a it's so complicated to learn Scala versus Python, for example. Like you would have to invest a lot of time and cycles into it, and with
Yeah.
Python everywhere else, it was I think it just kind of ate that alive. Like I don't see a lot of Scala developer postings these days.
No. No, and then I think it's a direct function. I remembered because I was doing a Spark project at Microsoft when I was working there towards the end of my tenure, and we were saying, okay, what is going to be the language that we're going to use for it? And at that point in time, the Python bindings to Spark weren't that great. They didn't encompass everything that you needed, so you couldn't really do a robust implementation of some sort of business process or business problem just using Python alone at that point in time. I talked to my lead engineer, and we both agreed with, like, look, once the Python becomes basically feature equivalent for all the things you need to do with Scala, no one's going to do Scala anymore, because Scala is hard. I don't know if anyone's ever studied it, but it's not for the faint of heart as a programming language.
It's difficult. But here's the funny thing with Spark is now um, SQL, the whole construct of using SQL basically became a first-class citizen, to the point where like data frames and Spark SQL is how you preferably interface with Spark. And now the question is, well, if that's how I have to interface with Spark, then why don't I just move things into like a data warehouse and then just use SQL? Because that might be an easier option for some people. So we're
Yeah,
actually adapting
absolutely.
that whole cycle. Is like, people are just like, well, I don't really need this data lake if I can put it into a data warehouse and just kind of do the same thing. So,
Yeah, it is interesting because I get a lot of people. They ask me about what should I learn, and is learning C. I mean, this is the thing that just drives me bonkers, right? Which is kind of why I have this thing back here
nice.
still. Is people are like, should I really invest in SQL? Or like, yes. And here's the reason why. At least for the foreseeable future, I can't see the tabular representation of data going away. Yes, networks and graphs, totally awesome. Yes, totally awesome. So many cool things you can do with them. So many valuable business things you can do with them. That being said, for most analytics professionals, most of the time, you're going to be still dealing with a tabular representation. SQL is perfectly designed for that, which is why, for example, I find that, for example, folks that know Excel, like business professionals that want to gain skills in data, if they're pretty good with Excel, they've got a lot of conceptual ideas already in place that easily translate to things like SQL, learning SQL, because you work with tables, you filter tables, you manipulate tables in Excel is what you do. Guess what you do in SQL? You do the same thing, right? We just call them projections, but but it's still manipulating the tables. And then it's similar with R, right? The base idea of R is a data frame because it was built by statisticians, so they didn't have to pay Bell Labs for S. So, but they're still working with tables of data. That's what everyone works with. So in the end, it's kind of like, yeah, SQL's kind of this universal thing. As long as you're working with a tabular representation of data and working with data is the primary thing that you do, SQL's not going to go away, as far as I can tell, anytime soon.
I totally agree with that. It was interesting. It was Eric Weber's post last week on LinkedIn, whether or not SQL was going away or not. I thought it was interesting. It got a lot of replies actually. And yeah, I think it the consensus as far as I could tell was people agreed that SQL is not going away anytime soon. There were a few people who wrote, "Oh yeah, well it's obsolete now," and it's like, what do you mean by obsolete? Like that's like saying gravity is kind of obsolete or something. It's just sort of here. Like I don't
Right.
know. So, like, have you heard of the Lindy effect before?
Mm.
So it's this, it describes a phenomenon, it's applicable to technology, especially where like after a certain point, the longer something's been around, the
Okay.
longer it will
Yeah.
continue being around. And SQL reminds me a lot of that. Like it's kind of the cockroach of I wouldn't necessarily say languages, I would almost say paradigms in a way. It's become almost like that. Like it's almost transcended being a language. I think it did
Yeah. I
that.
remember. I remember you brought that up in a comment, I think, on LinkedIn, and I replied that I need to brush up on my COBOL then,
Yeah, that's right. Yep. Uh-huh. So,
because it's still there, people. It's still running transactions. COBOL's still alive and well. Trust me.
yeah. And SQL, I mean, I think next to Excel, I mean, your point last month in the data engineering thing got me thinking a lot, really, about just the number of Excel users out there. And
Mhm.
I mean, because everyone tries to kill Excel off, and I'm like, that's just such a fruitless battle. Like, you have fun.
Yeah.
It
Try it.
ain't,
Yeah. You'll get it out of your CFO's cold, dead hands.
right.
That's how you get Excel out of his hands or her
Mhm.
hands. Yeah.
Multiplied by that number of companies around the world who are all using Excel or spreadsheets. I would say, some people use Google Sheets, but it's like regardless. Like my wife, the other day, she was showing me this workflow for her work. She underwrites loans, and she was showing me her workflow. I was like, this thing is insane. It's super error prone. Would you like me to write this in a database for you at some point? But she's like, this is what we use. I don't have time, even if I wanted to get away from this workflow. And I was like, you're right. You're right. And for better or for worse, it's what people will continue using. I would say once you have like what she has, which is this monstrosity of like 15 tabs in one workbook, and then tied to other workbooks, maybe you should think about consolidating that somehow. So,
Yeah. We had a term for those. We call them spread marts.
oh god, that's so awesome. Spread bars.
It's
Okay,
not mine. It's a guy I used to work with. He turned me on to the phrase. I'm like, yes, I have seen that.
that's perfect. That's so perfect. But that's a lot of business right now. I I would have a hard time thinking of a business that doesn't have that, because they just kind of
No,
organically grow. It's not like you intend like, oh, I want to have a spread mart. Like that's my ideal for my career, is managing that thing. But it sort of just happens. So,
Right. You don't see a LinkedIn headline that says "Spread Martist Extraordinaire." That's my claim to fame.
yeah, it's a hell that nobody wants to embark in, but it's a hell that I see a lot of people finding themselves in. It's kind of
Yeah.
like heavy drinking or something. Just one day it catches up to you, just like your spreadsheet does and your spread mart. So,
Yeah.
um,
What do they say about the road and good intentions? That's
yeah.
Excel, right? I'm adding a worksheet with good intentions. That's what
Mhm.
I'm doing.
But it
And
kind
I
of
add
like
another one.
another point though, which is, for people, it's a perfect vessel to learn analytics. It's a perfect vessel to learn data literacy. I couldn't think of a better one actually. And the more I pondered on what you were saying, it was like he's absolutely like 100% right on that. Like, and that's again
Yeah.
one insight though, and I would say, to your label heretical in that sense, right? Because like, why would we use Excel? Why don't we use like Python? And because that's obviously the easier approach. I'm
So
joking.
yeah. So I came to this conclusion, and like, I mean, it's not rocket science. I don't want to portray myself as a genius because that is not the case. And there's been articles in the Harvard Business Review that essentially say the same thing, which is like, if you're going to have a data literate organization, you have to use Excel as the tool just because of the installed base. It's just reality. What's interesting is that the firestorm, the pushback, the criticisms come not just from Pythonistas as well as our aficionados. It comes from statisticians as well. I mean, or people with statistical backgrounds. I mean, you suggest that someone does a linear regression in Excel and people lose their minds. It's so funny.
Yeah.
But to teach a manager the
Yeah.
basics, like look, I'm not expecting these people to necessarily model drug trials to understand whether or not a drug works or something like that, but just to have a manager understand the idea that these coefficients are estimated and they have uncertainty baked in. Just those concepts are amazing for a data professional, because then you can say, look, when you go to a manager and say, look, I will try to craft you a machine learning model, but until I try, I don't know if it's going to be effective based on what we need. But you still have to give me the money, the budget, the permission to go try. If they understand this idea of uncertainty, it makes sense to them. Whereas now they're like, what are you talking about? I'm going to give you budget and you better return an ROI in exchange for that budget.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting. I think COVID only makes it more interesting in that sense, where budgets are going to be increasingly under scrutiny. So, a lot of the fun projects, I don't know that they're going to get as much funding unless they're, producing a quick ROI. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Do you have any thoughts on how COVID's going to impact data?
Uh, so once again, I don't want to claim a genius. So I will back up what I'm about ready to say with the fact that I also read recently another Harvard Business Review article that was along similar lines of what I was thinking. So there you go. Always appeal to an external authority if you can. Um, this idea that if organizations continue to be working remote in a distributed fashion, and I think personally that's likely. I think that especially in the United States, we're going to see some more lockdowns coming because of just the explosion in case counts. My opinion. I'm not trying to start any sort of religious or political war here. That's just one man's opinion. Um, all that to say, I think this virtual distributed workforce thing is going to continue for a while, and it might actually become the new normal over a long enough timeline. And in that case, you need people that are data driven. They can't rely on sitting in a room and necessarily looking at body language and understanding the politics. You just need, it raises the importance of data and data driven decision making, consistent data driven decision making. And there's been an HBR article recently that basically said the same thing. And they had some good examples of like, from some old economy companies. I think it was like M&M Mars, the candy company, for example, and how they have raised data literacy up and are relying more and more on standardized kind of data driven processes to allow them to function and move quickly with a remote distributed workforce. So I think that's the biggest thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good opportunity for you. So
It's a good opportunity for everybody in
yeah,
theory.
yeah, sure. So well, cool. Well, I think we're coming up on almost an hour, so we'll cut it. But yeah, what's a way for people to find you if they wanted to learn more about you?
Yeah, if I haven't totally turned you off by the things I've been saying, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. That's my primary social media platform. And if you like some of the things I'm saying and you're interested in taking a gander at more of my content, you can check me out on daveondata.com.
Awesome. Cool. Well, hopefully we'll do this again in another month or two. So it's always good
Oh yeah,
chatting.
anytime. All
Yeah.
right, thanks, Joe. Have a good one.
All right. Thanks, buddy. All right. See ya.
Bye.